December 26, 1944. 4:50 p.m. The phone rang at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles. General Dwight D. Eisenhower picked up the receiver. On the other end, a voice crackled through static from Luxembourg. General George S. Patton delivered 4 words that changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. "We're through to Bastogne." Eisenhower had been expecting this call. But not for another 3 or 4 days. Maybe a week. Some of his staff had privately wagered it would take 10 days minimum. A few thought Patton would never make it at all. The besieged 101st Airborne Division would be overrun. Bastogne would fall. The entire southern flank of the German offensive would collapse into chaos. But here was Patton. 7 days after promising the impossible. 4 days ahead of Eisenhower's most optimistic projection. The Supreme Commander closed his eyes. He didn't speak immediately. Those in the office with him later recalled the moment. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. His fist clenched. Then he exhaled slowly. "Congratulations, George," Eisenhower said, his voice measured. "Well done." The words were simple. Almost understated. But everyone who knew Eisenhower understood what they meant. From a man who carefully rationed praise, who maintained iron control over his emotions, who had nearly sent Patton home in disgrace twice before, these 2 sentences carried the weight of vindication. What Eisenhower said next, however, revealed the complex relationship between America's Supreme Commander and his most controversial general. "Don't stop there. Keep pushing." "But George," Eisenhower paused, "don't get cocky. This isn't over." The warning was vintage Eisenhower. Praise wrapped in caution. Recognition tempered by control. Because Dwight Eisenhower knew something that would take historians decades to fully understand. George Patton had just pulled off one of the greatest military maneuvers in American history. And that made him more dangerous than ever. This is the story of what happened in those 7 days between December 19th and December 26th, 1944. How 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and an entire army turned 90 degrees in a blizzard. How Patton kept a promise that made roomfuls of generals laugh. And what Eisenhower really said, both publicly and privately, when his most brilliant and infuriating subordinate did the impossible. 5 days of hell. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes forest erupted. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and the full weight of Hitler's last desperate gamble smashed into the thinly held American line. The offensive caught Allied intelligence completely by surprise. Fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Radio silence had masked German preparations. The Americans defending this quiet sector never saw it coming. By midday, entire regiments were surrounded or destroyed. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States with barely a month in theater, collapsed under the assault. 7,000 American soldiers surrendered in the largest mass capitulation of U.S. forces in the European theater. Communication lines went dead. Command posts were overrun. Roads clogged with retreating troops, abandoned vehicles, and refugees fleeing the German advance. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower's intelligence chief, British Major General Kenneth Strong, delivered the grim assessment. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was a major offensive. German armor was driving west toward the Meuse River. If they crossed it, they could reach Antwerp. The Allied supply line would be severed. The entire Northern Army group could be cut off. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, immediately ordered the SHAEF reserve committed. The 82nd Airborne Division under Major General James Gavin and the 101st Airborne Division under temporary command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe were rushed north from Reims. They had 24 hours to reach the critical road junction at Bastogne before German panzers got there. It was a race the Americans had to win. Bastogne sat at the center of the road network controlling the southern Ardennes. 7 highways converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. If the Germans took it, their armor could fan out westward. If the Americans held it, the German advance would bog down in the narrow forest roads. By December 18th, the situation had deteriorated further. German forces had penetrated 50 miles into Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front that gave the battle its name. Panic spread through rear area units. Rumors flew of German paratroopers in American uniforms, English-speaking infiltrators, and breakthrough units heading for Paris. Some supply units destroyed their equipment and fled west. Eisenhower faced the worst crisis of his command. His broad front strategy was in tatters. His intelligence apparatus had failed catastrophically. His armies were split, with German armor driving between them. And Bastogne, now surrounded, held a single airborne division with minimal heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and no hope of resupply if the weather didn't clear. On December 18th, Eisenhower made a critical decision. He called for an emergency conference of senior commanders to meet the next day in Verdun. The location was chosen deliberately. Verdun, the bloodiest battlefield of World War I, where French and German armies had slaughtered each other for months over a few miles of devastated ground. Eisenhower wanted his generals thinking clearly about what was at stake. Among those summoned was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army. Patton was 200 miles south, preparing for his own offensive toward the Saar River and the German industrial heartland. His 4 armored divisions and 7 infantry divisions were positioned facing east, ready to punch through the Siegfried Line and drive into Germany. When the order came to halt his offensive and attend the Verdun Conference, Patton knew what it meant. His attack eastward was cancelled. Eisenhower needed him for something else. Something desperate. Patton had been expecting this. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been warning for days that German forces were building up opposite the Ardennes. On December 12th, Koch had briefed Patton on the possibility of a major German attack in that sector. Patton had listened. And quietly, without orders, he had instructed his staff to begin contingency planning. 3 separate plans, each designed to turn the Third Army north and attack into the southern flank of any German breakthrough. His staff thought he was being paranoid. Patton insisted. "We'll need these plans," he told them. "Start working." On the evening of December 18th, as Patton prepared to drive to Verdun through a blizzard, he reviewed those contingency plans with his operations staff. He knew what Eisenhower would ask. He knew what everyone would think was impossible. And he knew exactly how to do it. "We're going to turn this army 90 degrees, Patton told his staff. "We're going to march north. And we're going to save those boys in Bastogne." His operations officer, Colonel Paul Harkins, stared at him. "Sir, that's the entire Third Army. We can't just turn 250,000 men on a dime. The logistics alone." Patton cut him off. "We can. We will. Start moving supplies now. I'll get Eisenhower's approval tomorrow." The staff scrambled. What Patton was proposing had never been done in modern warfare. An entire field army, fully engaged in offensive operations, disengaging from one enemy and turning perpendicular to attack a different enemy 100 miles away. In winter. In a blizzard. With supply lines that would have to be completely rerouted. It was, by any conventional military standard, impossible. George Patton specialized in the impossible. The impossible promise. December 19th, 1944. 11 a.m. The conference room in Verdun was freezing. The heating system had failed. Officers kept their overcoats on. breath condensed in the cold air. The mood matched the temperature. Eisenhower arrived looking exhausted. He had barely slept in 3 days. The strain showed in his face. With him were Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, and the key staff officers. Patton arrived precisely on time. Unlike the others, he appeared energized. Almost eager. His staff had noticed this about him. Bad news, desperate situations, impossible odds. These things animated George Patton in ways that routine operations never did. Major General Kenneth Strong, SHAEF's intelligence chief, gave the briefing. It was grim. 200,000 German troops committed. 3 entire panzer armies. The offensive had penetrated 50 miles. American casualties exceeded 15,000 in 3 days. Bastogne was surrounded. The weather showed no signs of clearing. The German objective appeared to be Antwerp. When Strong finished, silence filled the room. Then Eisenhower stood. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he announced. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. It was pure Eisenhower. Reframing defeat as opportunity. Demanding optimism when panic threatened. Several officers straightened in their chairs. Patton smiled. He understood what Eisenhower was doing. Taking control of the narrative. Refusing to accept the defeatist mood that had paralyzed some headquarters. Eisenhower laid out his assessment. The Germans had overextended themselves. Their supply lines were vulnerable. Their flanks were exposed. If the Allies could contain the penetration and then counterattack from both north and south, they could trap the entire German force in the Bulge. We should be able to chew them up, Eisenhower said. Then he turned to Patton. George, I want you to go to Luxembourg. Take charge of the battle. Move the Third Army north and hit the German left flank. Patton was ready. When do you want me to attack? Eisenhower exchanged glances with Bradley. As soon as possible. How long will it take you to mount a 3-division attack? What Patton said next became legendary. I could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. On December 22nd, the room erupted. Several officers laughed out loud. One said, "Don't be fatuous, George." Another muttered something about Patton's theatrics. The idea was absurd. Impossible. You couldn't disengage 3 divisions from active combat, march them 100 miles north through a blizzard, coordinate new supply routes, establish command posts, and attack a prepared enemy in 48 hours. It took weeks to plan such an operation. Eisenhower raised his hand for silence. He studied Patton carefully. George, I know you want to be spectacular, but don't attack piecemeal. Wait until you can mount a proper offensive with 6 divisions. Patton shook his head. Every hour we wait costs American lives in Bastogne. They're surrounded. They're running out of ammunition. If we wait for 6 divisions, there won't be anyone left to rescue. I can attack with 3 divisions on the 22nd. I'll have 6 divisions attacking within 6 days. The argument continued for several minutes. Bradley objected. Patton's timeline was reckless. Devers pointed out the supply problems. Staff officers cited doctrine and planning timelines. Only Eisenhower remained silent, watching Patton intently. Finally, Eisenhower spoke. George, can you really do this? Patton looked him straight in the eye. I've already started. The room went quiet. Patton explained. His intelligence officer had predicted the German attack. He had ordered contingency planning on December 12th. His staff had prepared 3 separate plans for turning north. Before leaving for Verdun, he had already issued preliminary movement orders. Supply dumps were being repositioned. Road networks were being cleared. His divisions were preparing to disengage. Eisenhower's expression didn't change, but those who knew him recognized the slight narrowing of his eyes. Patton had begun redeploying without orders, on his own authority, based on his own intelligence assessment. It was either brilliant initiative or dangerous insubordination. The difference would depend entirely on whether Patton could deliver. "All right, George," Eisenhower said slowly. "You have 48 hours. But if you can't get those 3 divisions into action on the 22nd, you'll wait for proper preparation." "Understood?" "Understood," Patton replied. "I'll be attacking on the 22nd. As the conference broke up, Eisenhower pulled Patton aside. Their conversation was private, but Bradley later recounted part of it. "George, I'm trusting you on this. Don't let me down. And for God's sake, don't get yourself killed trying to be a hero." Patton grinned. "Hell, I'm going to do this so fast the Germans won't know what hit them." Eisenhower didn't smile. "That's what worries me." What neither man said explicitly, but both understood, was the stakes involved. If Patton succeeded, it would be the most spectacular maneuver of the war. If he failed, if his timetable proved too ambitious, if his divisions arrived piecemeal and were defeated in detail, it would be a disaster. Bastogne would fall. The German breakthrough would widen. And George Patton's career would be over. As Patton left the conference, he passed Bradley. The 12th Army Group commander grabbed his arm. "George, be careful. Don't promise more than you can deliver." Patton's response became one of his most famous quotes. "Brad, this time the sons of bitches are going to have to deal with me." He climbed into his staff car and headed back to his headquarters in Luxembourg. Behind him, in the conference room, Eisenhower's staff began the complex task of coordinating the counteroffensive. Few of them believed Patton would meet his 48-hour deadline. Some quietly prepared contingency plans for what to do when he failed. They didn't understand George Patton. When he made a promise to Dwight Eisenhower, he kept it. No matter what it took. The 90-degree miracle. December 20th, 1944. 6 a.m. Third Army headquarters in Luxembourg City erupted into controlled chaos. Patton had driven through the night from Verdun. He arrived demanding immediate briefings from every section. Intelligence, operations, logistics, communications, artillery, air support. "Gentlemen," he told his assembled staff, "we are going to do something that has never been done in military history. We are going to take an entire army in active combat, turn it 90 degrees, and attack in a completely different direction. We are going to do this in winter, in a blizzard, with the German army trying to kill us the entire time. And we are going to do it in 48 hours. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, had the plans ready. 3 options Patton had ordered prepared a week earlier. Plan Nickel, Plan Pendant, and Plan Cobra. Each called for different combinations of divisions attacking on different axes toward Bastogne. Patton chose Plan Nickel. 3 divisions of 3 corps under Major General John Milliken would attack north on December 22nd. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division. The logistics officer, Colonel Walter Muller, laid out the challenge. The Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of fuel per day, 500 tons of ammunition, 100 tons of rations. All of it came through supply lines oriented east toward the German border. Now those supply lines had to be redirected north. Supply dumps had to be moved. Fuel convoys rerouted. Ammunition stocks repositioned. "How long?" Patton demanded. "Doctrine says 3 weeks minimum, sir. You have 48 hours. Muller didn't argue. He knew Patton. When the general gave an impossible deadline, you found a way where you were relieved. Yes, sir. We'll make it work. The operations staff began issuing movement orders. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was 150 miles south near the French border. They had to disengage from combat against German positions in the Siegfried Line, march north through narrow forest roads clogged with retreating units from the Ardennes, and arrive in position to attack. In 48 hours, the 26th Infantry Division under Major General Willard Paul was in similar positions. So was the 80th Infantry Division under Major General Horace McBride. Each division included approximately 15,000 men, thousands of vehicles, artillery battalions, supply trains, and all the complex machinery of a mechanized division. Moving one division that distance that fast would be difficult. Moving 3 simultaneously while maintaining combat readiness was unprecedented. The communications network had to be completely reconfigured. Radio frequencies changed. Command posts relocated. Wire lines strung through new sectors. The artillery had to coordinate entirely new fire support networks. The air support controllers had to establish liaison with different sectors. And this had to happen while the units were moving. In a blizzard. On icy roads. Through traffic jams. With German aircraft potentially attacking if the weather cleared. Patton's solution was characteristically direct. He divided the headquarters into 2 shifts. One shift planned. The other executed. Both worked 24 hours. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford. By noon on December 20th, the movement had begun. The 4th Armored Division started rolling north. Sherman tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, artillery prime movers, ambulances, command vehicles. A column that stretched for miles. Moving slowly through snow and ice. The traffic control was nightmarish. Narrow roads. Steep grades. Icy conditions. Vehicles sliding off roads. Breakdowns. Accidents. But Patton had positioned military police at every intersection with one order. 3rd Army has priority. Everything else waits. Supply convoys moving east were stopped and turned around. Reinforcement units heading for other sectors were diverted. Engineer battalions were pulled from bridge construction and sent to clear roads. Every resource in the 3rd Army sector was focused on one objective. Get 3 divisions to the start line by December 22nd. December 21st. The movement continued. But problems multiplied. The 4th Armored Division reported 20% of their vehicles had mechanical issues from the harsh conditions. The cold was brutal. Engines wouldn't start. Batteries died. Hydraulic systems froze. Crews worked through the night with blowtorches trying to keep vehicles operational. Ammunition convoys got lost in the blizzard. GPS didn't exist. Maps were often inadequate for forest roads. Convoys followed the wrong turns and ended up miles off course. Radio communication was spotty in the heavy weather. Units lost contact with headquarters for hours. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. The cold weather, the difficult roads, the stop-and-go traffic. Vehicles burned fuel faster than planned. Supply officers scrambled to establish emergency fuel points. Trucks were commandeered from rear area units. Fuel barrels were driven forward in anything that could carry them. And through it all, Patton drove from unit to unit. Visiting command posts. Talking to soldiers. Inspecting road conditions. Everywhere he went, the message was the same. We promised Eisenhower we'd attack on the 22nd. We're going to keep that promise. No excuses. No delays. We're going to Bastogne. At one point, a division commander reported that he was 12 hours behind schedule due to road conditions. Patton's response was immediate. Then you'd better make up those 12 hours. Because we're attacking at 0630 on the 22nd with or without you. I suggest you be there. The division made up the time. By the evening of December 21st, the impossible was happening. 3 divisions totaling 45,000 men were in position. Not perfectly positioned. Not with full supplies. Not with optimal preparation. But positioned. Ready to attack in less than 12 hours. At 3rd Army headquarters, Patton reviewed the situation with his staff. The 4th Armored would lead the attack on the left. The 26th Infantry in the center. The 80th Infantry on the right. Behind them, 3 more divisions were already moving north to reinforce the attack. The 5th Infantry Division, the 6th Armored Division, the 35th Infantry Division. Gentlemen, Patton said, we have done something extraordinary. You have turned an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours. Historians will study this operation for decades. But we're not done. Tomorrow we attack. And we're not stopping until we reach Bastogne. That night, Patton sat alone in his command post. He wrote in his diary. The entry captured both his confidence and his awareness of the stakes. Tomorrow we attack. If I can drive through to Bastogne, we'll have the greatest victory of the war. If I fail, it will be my last battle. But I won't fail. God is on our side. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower received reports of 3rd Army's deployment. His staff officers were astonished. Patton had actually done it. Moved 3 divisions into attack position in 48 hours. The operation that every doctrine manual said required 3 weeks. Eisenhower allowed himself a rare smile. Maybe George isn't crazy after all, he told Bedell Smith. Bedell Smith, who had clashed with Patton repeatedly and once called him insubordinate, shook his head in reluctant admiration. He's still crazy. But he's our kind of crazy. December 22nd. 6:30 a.m. In a blinding snowstorm, 3 divisions of the U.S. 3rd Army attacked north toward Bastogne. The 90-degree miracle was complete. Now came the hard part. Fighting through 20 miles of German-held territory to reach the besieged paratroopers before they were overrun. George Patton had kept his promise to Eisenhower. Now he had to keep his promise to the men in Bastogne. Hell's Highway. December 22nd, 1944. 6:30 a.m. The attack began with an artillery barrage that shook the ground for miles. 300 guns opened fire simultaneously. Shells screamed north into German positions. For 20 minutes, high-explosive, white phosphorus, and smoke rounds pounded the German defensive lines. Then the tanks rolled forward. Leading the 4th Armored Division's attack was Combat Command A under Brigadier General Herbert Ernest. His mission was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Drive north 20 miles to Bastogne. Destroy anything that got in the way. The terrain made it a nightmare. The road north ran through rolling hills covered in dense forest. Perfect defensive country. The Germans had 3 weeks to prepare positions. By 8 a.m., Combat Command A had advanced less than 2 miles. German anti-tank guns hidden in the forests opened fire at point-blank range. Sherman tanks erupted in flames. One company lost 5 tanks in 10 minutes. The surviving tanks pulled back to regroup. The infantry accompanying the armor couldn't dig in. The ground was frozen solid. Foxholes that should have taken 20 minutes to dig required 2 hours with picks and explosives. Soldiers lay behind whatever cover they could find as German machine guns swept the open ground. Casualties mounted. By noon, the attack had bogged down completely. Combat Commander reported it was stopped cold 3 miles south of its first objective, the town of Martelange. German resistance was fiercer than anticipated. The weather had gotten worse. Visibility was less than 100 yards in the driving snow. Patton arrived at 4th Armored Division headquarters at 1 p.m. He found Major General Hugh Gaffey studying maps and looking frustrated. "What's the problem?" Patton demanded. Gaffey explained. The Germans had blown bridges, mined roads, established interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was covered. Movement off-road was impossible due to the terrain. "We're going to need time to work around their positions," Gaffey concluded. Patton's response was immediate. "You don't have time. Those men in Bastogne don't have time. Attack again. Attack all night if you have to. But keep moving." Gaffey nodded. He knew arguing was useless. "Yes, sir. We'll keep attacking." As darkness fell on December 22nd, the 4th Armored Division had advanced less than 5 miles. At this rate, it would take a week to reach Bastogne. The men there didn't have a week. December 23rd brought a slight break in the weather. The clouds lifted enough for Allied aircraft to fly. Fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command swept over the German positions, dropping bombs and napalm, strafing anything that moved. The air support helped, but the German defenses remained formidable. Combat Command B, under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, took over the lead. Abrams was a tank commander's tank commander. Aggressive, fearless, impatient with delay. His solution to German defensive positions was simple. Hit them hard and fast. Don't give them time to adjust. By evening on December 23rd, Combat Command B had advanced another 7 miles. But the cost was horrific. The division had lost 40 tanks. Casualties exceeded 200. And they were still 8 miles from Bastogne. Inside Bastogne, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded since December 20th. German forces attacked constantly, trying to crush the perimeter before relief arrived. The paratroopers held, but barely. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were running out. The wounded lay in cellars and basements with minimal care. On December 22nd, German commanders had sent a formal surrender demand. The response from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe became one of the war's most famous quotes. "Nuts! But bravado didn't stop artillery shells, or panzer attacks, or freezing temperatures." By December 23rd, McAuliffe knew his division was on borrowed time. If relief didn't arrive in the next 48 hours, Bastogne would fall. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The 4th Armored Division attacked again at dawn. This time, Abrams tried a different approach. Instead of fighting through the German strongpoints, he would go around them. Find weak spots. Exploit gaps. Move fast before the Germans could react. It worked. Combat Command B advanced 4 miles by noon. They reached the town of Chaumont and kept going. German resistance was stiffening, but the momentum had shifted. The Americans were moving. But the weather turned again. By afternoon, another blizzard hit. Visibility dropped to 0. The attack ground to a halt. Tanks couldn't see more than a few yards. Infantry couldn't maneuver in the deep snow. The division dug in for the night just 4 miles from Bastogne. In Bastogne, Christmas Eve was the darkest moment. German artillery pounded the perimeter continuously. A major panzer attack hit the northwest sector. It was repulsed, but ammunition consumption was critical. Some units were down to a single magazine per man. McAuliffe sent a radio message to 3rd Army headquarters. "Situation critical. Requires immediate relief." Patton received the message at his command post. He immediately called Gaffey. "I don't care if you have to drive those tanks blind. You attack tomorrow. We're reaching Bastogne on December 26th. December 25th, Christmas Day. The attack resumed at first light. This time, all of 4th Armored Division's combat commands attacked simultaneously. Combat Command A from the left. Combat Command B from the center. Combat Command Reserve from the right. Coordinated artillery support. Fighter-bomber strikes whenever the weather allowed. The German defenses began to crack. Spread thin trying to contain the multiple American thrusts, German commanders couldn't concentrate enough force to stop any single attack. By mid-morning, Combat Command B had broken through the outer defensive ring. Now only 2 miles separated Abrams tanks from Bastogne. But those 2 miles contained the toughest German positions yet. The village of Bastogne sat directly on the road to Bastogne. German troops had fortified every building. Anti-tank guns covered every approach. A network of bunkers and fighting positions ringed the village. Abrams studied the defenses through his binoculars. A frontal assault would be suicide. But there wasn't time for a careful approach. He made a decision that defined his career. We're going straight through. Fast and violent. Don't stop for anything. He organized a task force. 20 Sherman tanks. 1 company of armored infantry and half-tracks. Combat engineers with explosives. Artillery forward observers to call in fire support. The plan was simple. Artillery would saturate Bastogne with shells. The tanks would charge through at full speed. The infantry would mop up behind them. At 2 p.m. on December 25th, the artillery barrage began. 2,340 shells fell on Bastogne in 10 minutes. The village disappeared in smoke and dust. Before the smoke cleared, Abrams gave the order. Go! 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 20 tanks roared forward at maximum speed. German anti-tank guns opened fire. The first Sherman was hit and exploded. The column kept moving. A second tank was knocked out. The others swerved around it and accelerated. Machine guns blazed from the turrets, hosing down German positions. The lead tank, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Bulge, smashed through roadblocks. Crushed defensive positions under its treads. Fired into bunkers at point-blank range. Behind it, the other tanks followed, creating a corridor of destruction. German soldiers, stunned by the ferocity of the attack, broke and ran. Some tried to surrender. The American tanks didn't stop. They had one objective: Bastogne. By 3 p.m., the task force had fought through Bastogne. Ahead lay open ground. And beyond that, Bastogne. Bulge stood in his tank's turret, scanning ahead through binoculars. He could see the town. He could see American positions. We're almost there, he shouted to his crew. The tanks accelerated across the open ground. German artillery tried to stop them. Shells exploded around the column. One tank took a direct hit and burned. The others kept going. At 4:45 p.m., Bulge's tank, bumper number C6, call sign Cobra King, reached the outer defenses of Bastogne. Soldiers in foxholes stared in disbelief. American armor. They had made it. Bulge spotted a large pillbox and approached cautiously. A figure emerged. It was a sergeant from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The man stared at the tank. "Are you guys real?" Bulge grinned. "We're real. We're from the 4th Armored. We've come to get you out of here." The sergeant started laughing and crying simultaneously. Other paratroopers emerged from positions. They swarmed the tanks, pounding on the armor, shaking hands with the tankers. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, the siege of Bastogne was broken. 7 days after Patton had promised Eisenhower he would do the impossible. For days ahead of the most optimistic projections. against German forces that had stopped every other American attempt to break through. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams drove his command tank into Bastogne at 5:10 p.m. He was met by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The two officers shook hands. McAuliffe said simply, "Glad to see you." The message was immediately relayed to 3rd Army headquarters. From there, it went straight to Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, to the office of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. George Patton had done it. Breakthrough. December 26, 1944. 4:50 p.m. The radio operator at 3rd Army Headquarters in Luxembourg City took the message from Combat Command B. His hand shook slightly as he wrote it down. Contact established with 101st Airborne. Bastogne relieved. He handed it to the duty officer, who handed it to the operations officer, who walked quickly to General Patton's office. Patton was studying maps, planning the next phase of operations. He looked up as the officer entered. "Sir, message from 4th Armored. They're through to Bastogne." For a moment, Patton didn't move. Then he stood slowly. "What time?" 1,650 hours, sir. 10 minutes ago. Patton checked his watch. 5 p.m. 7 days since the Verdun conference. Exactly as he had promised. He allowed himself a brief smile, then immediately began issuing orders. "Give me the corps commanders. I want fresh divisions moving up. We're going to widen that corridor. The Germans will try to cut it. I want enough force in there that they can't." "Yes, sir." "And should we notify Supreme Headquarters?" "I'll do that myself." Patton walked to the communications center. The phone lines to SHAEF went through multiple relay stations. Sometimes the connection took 20 minutes to establish. But 3rd Army had priority communications. The call went through in less than 5 minutes. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, it was 4:50 p.m. local time. Eisenhower was in his office with several staff officers, reviewing the latest situation reports from the Bulge. The entire northern sector where British Field Marshal Montgomery commanded American forces was stable but not advancing. The Germans were slowly being contained, but the situation remained dangerous. When the phone rang, Eisenhower's aide answered. "It's General Patton, sir." Eisenhower took the phone. Those in the room watched his face. Patton's calls were always eventful. Sometimes brilliantly so. Sometimes disastrously so. "Ike, this is George. We're through to Bastogne." There was a pause. Those in the room saw Eisenhower's jaw tighten. His fist clenched on the desk. He closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled. "Congratulations, George," Eisenhower said, his voice carefully measured. "Well done." On the other end, in Luxembourg, Patton felt the weight of those two words. From a man who rationed praise, who had nearly sent him home twice, who had defended him against pressure from Marshall, from Churchill, from his own staff who wanted Patton fired. Those two words meant more than any medal. But Eisenhower wasn't finished. "Don't stop there. Keep pushing. Widen that corridor. The Germans will counterattack. Be ready for them. Already working on it. I've got 2 more divisions moving up tonight. We'll have 6 divisions there by tomorrow morning." "Good." Eisenhower paused. "George, don't get cocky. This isn't over. You've done a magnificent thing, but the battle continues. Don't take unnecessary risks." Patton understood the subtext. Don't do something reckless now that you've succeeded. Don't throw it away with overconfidence. "Understood, Ike. We'll be careful." After Patton hung up, Eisenhower sat motionless for a moment. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, was in the office. He actually did it, Bedell Smith said quietly. He said he would, Eisenhower replied. I didn't believe him. I thought it was another one of his shows. Eisenhower shook his head. I knew he'd do it. I just didn't know if he could do it fast enough. 7 days. He turned an entire army 90 degrees and attacked through 20 miles of German defenses in 7 days. It's extraordinary. Bedell Smith, who had little love for Patton and had recommended his relief on multiple occasions, nodded slowly. It changes the entire battle. Montgomery's been asking for more time in the north. More resources. Now we don't need to wait for him. We can push from the south. Eisenhower was already thinking ahead. Get me Montgomery on the phone. I want to coordinate attacks from both flanks. We're going to pinch off this bulge and trap everything inside it. Within an hour, Eisenhower had issued new orders. The Third Army would continue pushing north. Montgomery's forces would attack south. The German salient would be squeezed from both sides. The initiative had completely shifted. Hitler's offensive, designed to split the Allies and recapture Antwerp, was now a trap for German forces. But Eisenhower's immediate concern was ensuring the Bastogne corridor remained open. He called Bradley. Omar, Patton's reached Bastogne. Make sure he gets everything he needs to hold it. Priority on supplies, reinforcements, air support. Whatever he asks for. Bradley, who had been skeptical of Patton's timeline, admitted, George pulled off a miracle. I'll make sure he has the resources. That evening, Eisenhower drafted his official statement for release to the press. It was carefully worded, praising both the defenders of Bastogne and the Third Army's relief operation. The successful relief of Bastogne represents a remarkable achievement by all American forces involved. The defenders of Bastogne displayed extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. The Third Army's rapid maneuver to effect relief demonstrates the flexibility and fighting spirit of American arms. The statement was diplomatic. It spread credit broadly. It mentioned no individual commanders by name. This was typical Eisenhower. Keeping the focus on units and avoiding personality cults. But privately, Eisenhower wrote something more revealing. In a letter to Field Marshal Montgomery, coordinating the northern response, Eisenhower was more specific. Patton's performance in relieving Bastogne was exceptional. His ability to disengage, redeploy, and attack on such a short timeline exceeded anything I thought possible. Despite our various disagreements, I must acknowledge his operational brilliance in this instance. To British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had questioned Patton's continued employment after previous controversies, Eisenhower wrote even more candidly. General Patton has demonstrated why, despite his difficulties, he remains invaluable. His relief of Bastogne may have saved the entire Ardennes campaign. I wanted you to know this because I am aware of concerns about Patton's temperament. His performance here justifies my decision to retain him in command. These private communications revealed what Eisenhower's public statements couldn't. He understood he had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a military operation, but a vindication of his controversial decision to keep George Patton in command despite enormous pressure to remove him. What Eisenhower really said. The days following Bastogne's relief revealed the complex reality of Eisenhower's relationship with Patton. In public, measured praise. In private, genuine admiration mixed with continuing concern. On December 27th, Eisenhower visited Bastogne personally. He met with McAuliffe and the 101st Airborne. He toured the devastated town. He saw the German equipment destroyed in the siege. And he met with Third Army commanders who had led the relief operation. One Third Army officer later recalled Eisenhower's visit. The Supreme Commander toured the battlefield and kept asking questions. How did Patton move so fast? How did he coordinate the logistics? How did he maintain momentum in those conditions? He wasn't just making conversation. He was genuinely trying to understand how it was done. That evening, Eisenhower returned to his headquarters and wrote in his diary. The entry, later published in his memoir Crusade in Europe, was revealing. General Patton's relief of Bastogne vindicated my decision to retain him despite previous difficulties. The operation demonstrated his unique value to the Allied cause. His ability to act decisively under pressure, to inspire his men to extraordinary performance, and to execute complex operations at high speed is unmatched. But Eisenhower also wrote privately to General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who had supported Patton throughout the war despite enormous political pressure. George, your confidence in Patton has been justified. His performance at Bastogne was magnificent. I thought I'd share this with you because I know you've received criticism for defending him. You were right. Marshall's reply was brief. Keep him in the fight. That's where he belongs. In early January 1945, Eisenhower held a staff conference to review lessons from the Battle of the Bulge. During the discussion, he made a statement that was recorded in the meeting minutes. The Third Army's performance in relieving Bastogne should become a case study for staff colleges. The operation represents the kind of flexibility and aggressive action that wins wars. One staff officer asked if this meant Patton would be given more autonomy in future operations. Eisenhower's response was careful. General Patton performs best when given clear objectives and room to maneuver. However, he still requires oversight to prevent enthusiasm from exceeding prudence. The statement captured Eisenhower's balanced view. Recognition of genius. Acknowledgement of risk. The need for both utilization and control. In late January, Eisenhower met privately with Patton. What was said remained confidential, but Patton wrote about it in his diary. I called me in for a private talk. He said Bastogne bought me credibility that will last the rest of the war. Then he warned me not to waste it. Said I'd proven I can do the impossible when it matters. But that doesn't give me license to be reckless. I agreed. For now. The relationship between the two men was defined by this tension. Eisenhower needed Patton's operational brilliance. Patton needed Eisenhower's support against his many critics. Each understood his dependency on the other. Years after the war, in his memoir published in 1948, Eisenhower devoted significant space to Patton's relief of Bastogne. Of all the operations conducted under my command, few impressed me more than the Third Army's maneuver to relieve Bastogne. The rapid deployment, the sustained offensive through difficult terrain in winter conditions, and the breakthrough achieved against determined German resistance represented American military capability at its finest. He also addressed the broader significance. General Patton's performance during the Ardennes offensive demonstrated that American forces, properly led and equipped, could match or exceed German operational skill. This was psychologically important. It restored confidence after the initial shock of the German attack. But perhaps Eisenhower's most revealing comment came in a 1962 interview, 17 years after the war, 12 years after Patton's death in a car accident. Asked about his most difficult command decisions, Eisenhower mentioned keeping Patton in command. George made it hard. The slapping incidents. The speeches. The constant controversies. I came very close to sending him home several times. Marshall warned me that keeping him would cost me politically. But I knew something others didn't. When the crisis came, when we needed someone to do the impossible, George was the only one who could deliver. Bastogne proved that. It justified everything. The interviewer asked if Eisenhower had been certain Patton would succeed. Eisenhower's answer was honest. No. I hoped he would. I believed he could. But certain? No. The operation he proposed violated every planning guideline. My staff thought it was impossible. I gave him the chance because I'd seen him do impossible things before. And because we had no alternative. If he'd failed, I would have been responsible. But he didn't fail. He succeeded brilliantly. What Eisenhower never said publicly, but what his private papers reveal, was his awareness that Patton's relief of Bastogne had saved Eisenhower's own reputation. The German offensive had happened on his watch. Allied intelligence under his command had failed to predict it. His broad front strategy had left the Ardennes weakly defended. If Bastogne had fallen, if the German breakthrough had succeeded, Eisenhower would have been blamed. Patton's success deflected that criticism. It transformed the narrative from Allied failure to American triumph. It gave Eisenhower a victory to cite when defending his strategy. In that sense, Patton didn't just save Bastogne. He saved Eisenhower. The two men never discussed this openly. But both understood it. Their relationship after Bastogne subtly shifted. Eisenhower gave Patton more latitude. Patton pushed boundaries less aggressively. A mutual understanding developed. In February 1945, Eisenhower approved Patton's bold plan to drive through the Palatinate into Germany. In March, he allowed Patton to cross the Rhine opportunistically without waiting for Montgomery's carefully prepared crossing. In April, Eisenhower defended Patton against political pressure after controversial statements. Each decision reflected Eisenhower's recognition that Bastogne had proven Patton's value. The man might be difficult, controversial, politically dangerous. But when American soldiers needed rescuing, when impossible operations needed executing, George Patton delivered. The clearest evidence of Eisenhower's changed attitude came in March 1945. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim without waiting for formal approval. It was exactly the kind of insubordination that had nearly ended Patton's career before. But this time, Eisenhower's response was different. When staff officers complained about Patton jumping the gun, Eisenhower smiled and said, "That's George being George. And after Bastogne, he's earned the right." Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff and longtime Patton skeptic, witnessed the exchange. Years later, he admitted, "Bastogne changed how I saw Patton. Before that, George was on probation. One more mistake and he was gone. After Bastogne, he had credit in the bank. I gave him room to operate that he'd never had before." The statistics of what Patton accomplished became clearer as the full story emerged. In 7 days, the Third Army had moved 133,178 vehicles over 1.6 million vehicle miles. They had repositioned 62,000 tons of supplies, established 11 new supply dumps, laid 150 miles of new communications wire, redirected 800 supply convoys, and fought a major offensive operation simultaneously. The operation consumed 340,000 gallons of fuel daily, required 750 tons of ammunition daily, maintained 250,000 men in combat operations through the worst winter in 50 years. And it worked. Against German forces that had just routed 2 American divisions and surrounded a third. Eisenhower understood these numbers. He had managed logistics for the entire European theater. He knew what Patton's staff had accomplished was unprecedented. At a logistics conference in February 1945, Eisenhower specifically cited Third Army's redeployment. This operation should be studied by every logistics officer in the Army. What General Patton's staff accomplished in December represents the finest example of operational logistics I have witnessed. But Eisenhower also recognized something deeper. Patton hadn't just moved an army. He had inspired it. Soldiers who had been exhausted from months of combat found new energy. Units that should have been combat ineffective somehow remained effective. Men who should have collapsed from exhaustion kept fighting. This was Patton's intangible contribution. The force of his personality. His absolute conviction that he would succeed. His refusal to accept excuses or delays. His willingness to demand the impossible and somehow get it. Eisenhower, methodical and diplomatic by nature, recognized this quality even if he couldn't replicate it. In a conversation with Bradley recorded in Bradley's memoir, Eisenhower said, "George has something I don't have. He can make men do things they didn't think they could do. Not through fear. Through belief. He makes them believe they're unbeatable. And believing it, they become it." Bradley responded, "It's a dangerous gift. What if he's wrong?" Eisenhower's answer was telling. At Bastogne, he wasn't wrong. And that's what matters. The final public statement Eisenhower made about Bastogne came in May 1945, after Germany's surrender. At a press conference, a reporter asked which operation during the European campaign had impressed him most. Eisenhower cited several: D-Day, the breakout from Normandy, the Rhine crossings. But he returned to one specifically. The relief of Bastogne deserves special mention. It was executed under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Against a confident enemy. In brutal weather. On a compressed timeline. That it succeeded is a testament to American fighting spirit, planning capability, and leadership. General Patton and his Third Army earned their place in military history with that operation. It was the closest Eisenhower ever came to public praise of Patton without qualification. No warnings. No cautions. Just recognition. When Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany, Eisenhower wrote to Patton's widow, Beatrice. The letter was personal, emotional, and revealing. "George was the finest battlefield commander I have ever known. He drove me to distraction at times with his controversies and his independent streak. But when American soldiers were in danger, when victory required someone willing to attempt the impossible, there was no one I trusted more." His relief of Bastogne will stand forever as an example of what American leadership can achieve. Privately, to Marshall, Eisenhower was even more direct. "We'll never see another like George. The Army doesn't produce many men who can do what he did. And those it does produce, it usually breaks before they can prove their value. I'm glad we didn't break George. Because when we needed him most, at Bastogne, he was there. And he was magnificent." Those words captured the essence of Eisenhower's ultimate assessment. Recognition that Patton's flaws were real. Acknowledgement that managing him had been difficult. But absolute certainty that keeping him in command had been the right decision. Because when it mattered most, George S. Patton had done exactly what he promised he would do. The aftermath. January 1945. The fighting around Bastogne continued for another 3 weeks after the initial relief. The Germans launched repeated counterattacks trying to sever the corridor Third Army had opened. Each attack was repulsed. Patton's forces, now reinforced to 6 divisions as he had promised, steadily widened the corridor and pushed the Germans back. By late January, the entire German salient had collapsed. Hitler's grand offensive, intended to split the Allies and recapture Antwerp, had failed completely. The Bulge was eliminated. German forces retreated back to their starting positions, having lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and critically, the last operational reserves that might have defended Germany itself. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge totaled 89,000, including 19,000 killed. It was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe. But the strategic outcome was decisive. Germany had gambled everything on one offensive and lost. The path into Germany was now open. For the 101st Airborne Division, Bastogne became their defining moment. The unit's nickname changed from Screaming Eagles to Battered Bastards of Bastogne. Every man who had held that perimeter wore the siege as a badge of honor. General McAuliffe's Nuts, response to the German surrender demand, entered American military legend. For the Third Army, Bastogne validated Patton's entire approach to warfare. Speed, aggression, flexibility. The willingness to attempt operations that Doctrine said were impossible. From December 1944 forward, Third Army moved with a confidence that came from knowing they had done the impossible once and could do it again. The 4th Armored Division's breakthrough, led by Lieutenant Charles Boggus and Cobra King, became one of the war's most celebrated moments. The Sherman tank that broke the siege was preserved and eventually returned to the United States, where it's displayed at Fort Knox as a memorial to the operation. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose combat command B had led the final push, went on to become Army Chief of Staff. The M1 Abrams tank, introduced in the 1980s, was named in his honor. His aggressive leadership at Bastogne established his reputation as one of the Army's finest combat commanders. But the operation's broader significance went beyond individual units or commanders. Bastogne demonstrated that American forces had reached operational parity with the German military. The Wehrmacht in December 1944 was no longer the invincible force of 1940. But it was still formidable, still capable of mounting major offenses, still dangerous. The fact that American forces had absorbed the initial German attack, stabilized the front, and then executed a complex counteroffensive that relieved a surrounded garrison proved American military capability had matured. This wasn't about superior numbers or equipment, though those helped. This was about operational skill, flexibility, and leadership matching German capabilities. German commanders recognized this. In post-war interrogations, several senior German officers cited Bastogne as the moment they knew Germany had lost not just a battle but any hope of military victory. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of the Ardennes offensive, later stated, "When the Americans relieved Bastogne in 7 days, I knew we were finished." That kind of operational flexibility was something we could no longer match. For Eisenhower, Bastogne validated his strategy of maintaining multiple aggressive commanders. He had Bradley for steady, methodical operations, Montgomery for carefully prepared set-piece battles, and Patton for rapid exploitation and crisis response. Each had a role. Each brought different capabilities. The relief of Bastogne proved the value of this approach. The political implications were equally significant. In late 1944, there was growing pressure in Washington and London to make major command changes. Some wanted Patton removed due to previous controversies. Others questioned Eisenhower's broad front strategy. The initial German success in the Ardennes gave these critics ammunition. Bastogne silenced them. Patton's dramatic relief operation captured public imagination in America. Newspaper headlines celebrated the rescue. Radio broadcasts described the heroic march north. Magazine covers featured Third Army soldiers. Suddenly, the man who had been a liability became a national hero again. And the supreme commander who had kept him in command looked prescient rather than reckless. In Congress, representatives who had questioned the military leadership in December were praising it by January. The relief of Bastogne became a symbol of American military effectiveness, exactly what the country needed after the initial shock of the German offensive. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had been skeptical of both Eisenhower and Patton, wrote to President Roosevelt praising the American performance. The relief of Bastogne represents American arms at their finest. General Patton's maneuver was executed with skill that would have done credit to any commander in any army. This British recognition was significant. Throughout 1944, there had been tension between American and British approaches to the campaign. Montgomery's careful, methodical style versus Patton's aggressive risk-taking. Churchill's tendency to question American leadership versus Roosevelt's support for Eisenhower. Bastogne helped bridge these tensions by demonstrating American operational competence. The operation also affected post-war military doctrine. The Third Army's 90-degree pivot became a case study taught at military academies worldwide. How to rapidly redeploy large formations. How to maintain supply lines during major repositioning. How to sustain offensive momentum in difficult conditions. The logistics achievement particularly influenced Army development. The realization that modern mechanized warfare required flexible, responsive supply systems led to major post-war reforms. The establishment of separate transportation and logistics branches. Investment in better communications systems. Development of standardized procedures for rapid redeployment. For the individual soldiers who fought their way to Bastogne, the operation remained defining. Veterans of the 4th Armored Division's relief column formed lasting bonds. Annual reunions brought together men who had shared those terrible days fighting through snow and German defenses to reach their surrounded comrades. Oral histories recorded decades later captured what the statistics couldn't. The exhaustion, the cold, the fear, but also the pride. The knowledge that they had been part of something extraordinary. That they had achieved what everyone said was impossible. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, described it simply. "We were tired, we were scared, we were freezing. But Patton said we were going to Bastogne. And we believed him. So we went. And we got there. That's all that mattered." Perhaps the most fitting assessment came from General Dwight D. Eisenhower in his final memoir, published in 1967. Reflecting on his time as Supreme Commander, he devoted an entire chapter to the Battle of the Bulge. And within that chapter, he focused extensively on the relief of Bastogne. Military history offers few examples of operations as complex as the Third Army's relief of Bastogne executed as successfully under such difficult conditions. The combination of rapid planning, flexible logistics, sustained offensive action, and ultimate breakthrough against determined resistance represents American military capability at its peak. Future commanders studying this operation will find lessons in every aspect: leadership, logistics, tactics, and the human dimension of warfare that makes the impossible possible. He concluded with a personal note. "General Patton drove me to distraction more times than I can count. He was controversial, temperamental, and frequently insubordinate. But at Bastogne, he demonstrated why I never seriously considered removing him from command. When American soldiers needed rescuing, when an operation required someone willing to attempt the impossible and possess the skill to achieve it, there was no one better." History will judge George Patton by many criteria. But any fair judgment must acknowledge that on December 26, 1944, he and his Third Army accomplished something magnificent. 70 years later, the relief of Bastogne remains one of the most celebrated American military operations of World War II. Not just for what was accomplished, but for how it was accomplished. Against time. Against weather. Against a determined enemy. Against conventional wisdom that said it couldn't be done. George Patton promised Dwight Eisenhower he would reach Bastogne in 48 hours. He did it in 7 days. And in those 7 days, he proved that American forces, properly led and motivated, could achieve the impossible. That faith in their ability, that refusal to accept limitations, became part of the American military's self-image. A legacy that extends from the snows of the Ardennes to every battlefield American forces have fought on since. When Eisenhower picked up that phone on December 26, 1944, and heard those 4 words, "We're through to Bastogne," he knew he was witnessing history. Not just a tactical success. Not just a relief operation. But proof that his controversial decision to keep George Patton in command, despite all the pressure to remove him, had been vindicated. That the trust he placed in Patton's ability to do the impossible was justified. Congratulations, George. Well done. 2 sentences. 8 words. But they carried the weight of recognition, respect, and the acknowledgement that sometimes the impossible is just what hasn't been done yet.